Great. Okay, so people should be joining now. Panelists can see the attendees joining on the top right, where you'll see the numbers going up in the attendees tab. And so we'll just give it a minute or so to let everybody join. And just so everybody's aware, I think we're expecting around between 30 and 40 people for this webinar. So I think we have 14 so far. Starting to slow down now. Great. Okay, I think I'm going to start now. So my name is Ruchir Shah. I'm the Director of External Affairs at the Scottish Wildlife Trust. And this is an event that's been sponsored by the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital for the Scottish Conservation Finance Pioneers Group. And it's very much part of a series of events that the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital is organising in the run-up to COP26. This particular event on marine finance is one of the first that we've been running for the Scottish Conservation Finance Pioneers Group. We've also got people have been invited through the Link Marine subgroup as well, the Scottish Environment Link. So there's a really interesting mix of people from the Scottish Conservation Finance Pioneers Network and the Link Marine Group here as well. Plus there will be others as well that have been invited. So hopefully we'll have a really good discussion today. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Gail, Olivia, and Sarah, who are going to be our speakers today. And Sam Collin is going to chair the webinar, who is my colleague. He's the Living Seas Manager at the Scottish Wildlife Trust. And just so everybody's aware, this event is being recorded for public viewing later. The Q&A and chat facilities are also available to be used, but we won't be doing, we won't be taking inviting people to speak directly. It'll be more through the chat and Q&A, if that's okay. So I'm going to pass over to Sam now. Sam, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ruchir, and welcome everyone to the webinar, and thank you for attending. Today's webinar really stems from a collaborative project between the Scottish Wildlife Trust and SEPA called the £1 Billion Challenge, which aims to unlock novel opportunities for investment in nature conservation. And of the 9 pillars that were identified within that project, establishing a marine fund was one that really focused on the marine environment. And within this pillar, we proposed the idea of setting up a marine fund that was financed by contributions from industries that rely on the marine environment. And this fund would go to support conservation and restoration activities. Now, there are lots of different options for establishing a marine fund, which is why this webinar was really set up to kind of explore those different options and stimulate some discussion around how to encourage payments into marine funds and increase the amount of finance available to support marine conservation. So from the £1 Billion Challenge, the Conservation Finance Pioneers Group was established. And today's webinar is really to present different opportunities for marine funds, but also to continue establish discussions around marine funds that can continue beyond this webinar. And so today's webinar will begin with 3 presentations, one by Gail Hurley, another by Olivia Bennett, and the last one by Sarah Brown, and each of which will provide insights into different approaches for developing marine funds. If there is time between the presentations, I'll take 1 or 2 questions that are specific to that presentation. But after all 3 presentations have been finished, we'll open it up to more general discussion around marine funds. And as Ruchir mentioned, the chat box is open, so if you have any questions, please put them in there. So moving on to the presentations, our first presentation is by Gail Hurley. And Gail is an independent advisor on sustainable finance based in Edinburgh. She works with the United Nations, foundations and non-profit organisations on various aspects of sustainable finance and international development, and has worked extensively on blue economy financing in several countries around the world. Prior to relocating to Edinburgh, Gail spent 10 years with the United Nations Development Programme in New York, where she was a senior advisor and policy specialist on development finance. She has also held roles in the non-profit sector. So Gail, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you, Rashia, and a very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this discussion today. Thanks so much to the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital for running this webinar on this important topic. I'm delighted to join you, and I'm really excited to hear more about Scotland's plans for a marine fund, which I think can make a really important contribution to marine conservation in Scotland. So just to add to Sam's introduction, I'm passionate about the conservation of our oceans, and my own personal interest in this topic is really around how we can mobilize and channel more finance to ocean conservation, which is, I can't emphasize this strongly enough, is especially critical in a context in which we see that SDG 14, life underwater, is consistently one of the most underfunded of all the SDGs. So in my remarks today, I wanted to share a few perspectives and observations from my work on various types of marine fund in several countries around the world, mostly in developing countries, I should say, and blue economy investing. So what are some of the issues that other countries have been thinking about as they've been conceptualizing their own marine funds, what models are being tested and explored. And I can also say a few words around the common themes and challenges which are emerging no matter what the country or the local context. But perhaps before I speak about that, what I would say is that we have seen a significant rise in recent years in awareness of the critical importance of marine ecosystems. So for many years, there's been much more focus on terrestrial environments, and they're very important too, of course. But I think now we're seeing a broader appreciation of marine ecosystems and the valuable ecosystem services that oceans provide, and of course the impacts that climate change is having on marine environments. In particular, I think, especially over the last 5 years, there's been increasing interest in the investment community, amongst governments, the donor community, banks, around how we can actually mobilize and channel more resources for the protection and enhancement of natural marine environments. And I think in particular the ways in which public and private financing streams can be used in complementary ways for ocean conservation. And we've seen a lot of new initiatives emerge over recent years that try to achieve these aims in different ways. So to name just a few, there's Althelia's Sustainable Ocean Fund, launched in 2016, which channels commercial impact investment to address to areas such as sustainable seafood and ocean conservation in developing countries. We saw last year the exciting launch of the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, which will use grant financing and technical assistance to crowd in private investment capital for investments in the protection of coral reefs. I have to apologize, I'm actually having a bike lane installed, well, not me personally, but a bicycle lane is being installed outside my house today. So I apologize for the noise. This is very good, of course, the bicycle lane, but it's a little noisy for a few days, I think. So we've also, within the EU, we've also seen the EU's Blue Invest program develop over recent years, which supports entrepreneurs in the blue economy in European countries, providing them with technical assistance, with grant financing to grow their blue economy businesses and explore innovations in the blue economy. And we've seen a lot of countries worldwide adopt blue economy action plans, investment strategies. I've had the opportunity to work on a couple of those. So a lot is happening in this field, and that's great. But it's also happening from a very low base to start with, I think. And so what I would say is that there's still a lot of learning going on. Okay, so a few perspectives from my own work and experience working to develop various types of marine-focused funds in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Papua New Guinea. So the Caribbean first, where a lot is happening on the blue economy, and that's not before time. They've woken up to the importance of their ocean assets in the region. So there I've been working with colleagues in Grenada and Jamaica, looking at options for the development of a Caribbean blue economy financing facility, which, like Scotland, is still very much in its early design stages, looking at what it could do, the types of financing it could provide, its long-term revenue model, its governance model as well. But the Caribbean very much recognizes that its ocean assets are responsible for the majority of its livelihoods, that its coral reefs are severely depleted, over 80% of its reefs are damaged in some way, and yet across the region there is no single dedicated financing facility for funding ocean conservation. So this facility very much aims to fill that gap. And we've been exploring models of marine fund which would very much offer a variety of financial instruments. So in addition to traditional grant funding, to business and community groups working on ocean conservation, there would also very much be a focus on sustainable livelihoods linked to the blue economy. So looking at the way the fund could also provide equity finance, offer loan financing with a particular focus on early stage financing where investors are sometimes more reluctant to come in, where risks are more elevated, that the facility could also offer guarantees, working in partnerships perhaps with local banks and donors to help offset the risk that donors or that banks would take, and encourage them to actually lend to new sustainable blue livelihoods businesses. We've also been looking at ways the fund can be sustainable over time. So its ability to receive funds from a variety of sources, including private sector partners, tourism revenues, what we're calling blue fees, donors, governments, philanthropies, in addition to credit reflows, and therefore guaranteeing sustainable revenue streams over time for its work. So that's very much a fund which is still under elaboration right now, but there's some of the things that we have been working on in the design of that facility. In Papua New Guinea, I've been working on a much smaller initiative in marine financing, but perhaps no less ambitious in a local context. But again, a focus very much as well on sustainable livelihoods linked to the blue economy. So a blue economy enterprise incubation facility is the plan there, which will provide not only financing for ongoing marine protected areas within the country, but provide financing again through equity investments, loans, grant financing as well, to support people to engage in income generating activities linked to the local marine environment, provided that they're carried out in ways that protect the natural environment. And again here, you know, partnerships with external finance providers are very much part of that marine fund. partnerships with local banks to design financial products specifically for the blue economy, working with banks to extend guarantees to support banks to actually lend to the sector, because many don't understand the sector very well. They still think it's high risk. The risks are very much uncertain. It's an unknown market still. So the fund working with banks to help them to engage in that unknown market through providing early stage grant financing, technical assistance, and guarantee financing as well. So perhaps a few observations for those working on the Scottish context and the Marine Fund here. Because some common issues and challenges always emerge. So the first is, I think one of the most interesting parts of this work for me has been the thinking around how we can move beyond traditional grant-based, whether that's government funding or philanthropic funding. We can move beyond marine funds that focus on that towards more sophisticated financing mechanisms for the blue economy that have the ability to deploy a wider range of financial instruments, including concessional lending, equity, investments, guarantees, and also the extent to which they can blend their funds with the finance from other players. And I think, in that context, there may be interesting opportunities to explore and how Scotland's Marine Fund might be able to work and engage with the Scottish National Investment Bank, for example. For me, Marine Fund's abilities to meet key gaps in capital markets. So, for example, their ability to provide early stage financing for sustainable marine businesses that perhaps haven't had the time to kind of prove themselves in the marketplace, their ability to provide patient capital or to take on more risk, basically the ability to go where other investors won't go, I think will also be a key indicator of their value added in the financing marketplace as well. A second observation sort of linked to the above is how can marine funds of various kinds work with other established finance providers in the marketplace to accelerate investments in a sustainable ocean economy? So how can they blend their financing with that of other actors in complementary ways? Where does the Marine Fund come in? Where do banks come in? Where does perhaps the Scottish National Bank, National Investment Bank come in, or other actors to actually ensure that finance is used in complementary ways? Some finance, would be best placed to come in at the early stages of the project cycle to help, where the risks are higher. Other capital seeks a commercial return and has a lower risk tolerance, might come in later. The third is that governance matters. So especially in the context of the countries where I was working, and there's more institutional weaknesses than perhaps there is in the Scottish context, robust governance structures definitely matter, to ensure that the transparent and effective use of funds and to avoid political interference. I mean, that's universally applicable, of course, but I think the importance of ensuring things like avenues for community participation or civil society engagement, robust impact and performance monitoring frameworks are increasingly important as well today. So finally, the final observation is on the pipeline. I still see a lot of need for technical advisory support, financing for feasibility studies, to actually get new livelihood opportunities connected to sustainable marine environments to the point where they're perhaps ready to receive investment from other sources. And I see that very much as still a gap in the market, and something where there's very much a need for certain players to perhaps come in, and is that something the Marine Fund is thinking about doing and wants to do. So it's very much about an ecosystem of support. I think, you know, there's still a lot of uncertainty out there about how to create viable and sustainable revenue streams from the valuable ecosystem services that marine environments are providing. But we're seeing definite uptick in interest in marine environments, in their conservation, how we can create also business opportunities, livelihood opportunities connected to sustainable marine environments that embed sustainability in their work. I think it's very much about understanding what the financing needs and gaps are in the market and making sure that the right financing is available at the right time. But I'm really encouraged by the positive direction of challenge, and really excited to hear from Sarah about the Marine Fund development in Scotland, and also from Olivia, because they've been, you know, they've recently launched their own Blue Impact Fund, which I think touches on many of the issues that I've raised on marine financing in the UK. So very much excited to learn more from them, and I look forward to your questions and comments in the discussion. Thanks a lot.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Gail. There's a question coming from John Utley. I'll just ask now, are there any good examples of investment into regenerative business models that grow natural capital and increase supplies of ecosystem services and go beyond sustainability or do no harm? Can you see that one, Gail?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. No, thanks, John, for that. I think what we've seen in marine environments in terms of marine investing, and I speak about this from a sort of the business kind of model approach, is that, you know, there's been a lot of focus on fisheries and aquaculture, mariculture. There's been some investment in kind of doing port infrastructure better. But, you know, in terms of how do we translate, you know, the restoration of mangrove ecosystems into long-term sustainable revenue streams, I think, you know, that's still a lot more challenging. You know, the commercial money is tending to go into the areas where there is sort of more certainty around, you know, does this represent a viable business proposition like fisheries, sustainable fisheries, or ports, or marine renewable energy, rather than you know, on some of the work around sort of marine conservation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gail. Okay, so moving on to our second presentation, which is by Olivia Bennett. So Olivia is a senior associate at Finance Earth, an environmental impact investment advisor and fund manager, where she has worked with a range of conservation organisations, local and national governments, and private sector companies to design and create projects that benefit nature, communities, and investors. Since joining Finance Earth in 2018, Olivia has been working with WWF UK to identify opportunities to finance the protection of the marine environment, resulting in the launch of the Blue Impact Fund in 2020. Prior to joining Finance Earth, Olivia worked in corporate and investment banking, where she took a particular interest in the development of green sustainability-linked markets. So, Olivia, are you okay to, have you got a PowerPoint So share your screen.
I do have a PowerPoint. I'll see if I can pull this up now. Can everyone see what should be a big whale on the screen?
Yes.
Perfect. That's good news. So thank you very much for the introduction, Sam, and to the rest of the team for organising this, and thanks, Gail, for starting us off. It was really interesting to hear your reflections, and I think there's a lot that resonates with our experience as well. So it'll be interesting to continue the discussion on a lot of those points. So I'm here to talk about the Blue Impact Fund. Some of you may or may not have come across this. We've kind of recently soft launched it at the EKN Natural Capital Investment Conference in November last year. And so today I'll give a little bit more of a background as to how we got to where we are today with the Blue Impact Fund. So Sam's given a great introduction to me, thank you. And I think it might be helpful just to give a little bit of an introduction to who Finance Earth is, or who we are as an organisation. So we're a mission-driven business. We do investment advisory and fund management services for environmental organisations. And the aim of all of our work is really to design and create and implement market-based mechanisms and bespoke tools for nature-based projects, or projects that benefit nature. So we have three kind of main parts to our business. We start out looking at kind of early stage projects, developing revenue models and business models, and helping the conservation sector and corporate and public sector organizations to really understand new ways of investing in nature. Once we've identified potential opportunities for investing in nature, we then take those opportunities further to try and build fund models or other investment models that can be used to really deliver the needed funding, finance, and other types of support into those projects. And then finally, we are a regulated fund manager. So we have three funds currently under management that you can see there. The first is CORE, which is a renewable energy fund, transitioning commercial and operational ground-mounted solar energy sites into community ownership. We have Picnic, which looks at parks and green spaces, social enterprise operating in those areas, and how we can invest in those types of enterprises. And finally, we have the Blue Impact Fund, which we'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes. But I think what is key to our process with the Blue Impact Fund and with our other work is that we really work across that spectrum. So really trying to develop projects from early stages. Gail was talking about kind of capacity building and investment readiness, and how we create the pipeline of opportunities for the types of investment that we want to put into these highly impactful, value additive projects. So working with WWF, we've been working together since 2018, so 3 years now, and we've been looking specifically at the UK blue economy, the UK marine environment, and how we can protect and restore UK marine ecosystems. And early on in our work with WWF, we understood that there is a huge transformation that is currently underway and going to rapidly accelerate in the coming decades. And that is the transition of the blue economy from a kind of smaller part of our overall economy to a fast-growing sector. The problem is that existing blue economy activity is not always sustainable, or in fact it's often quite unsustainable and has therefore been degrading and destroying the natural environment on which our communities and our societies depend, as well as marine wildlife. So we have existing technologies and expertise that is attempting to solve this problem. But they're a very small part of the overall blue economy sector. And so what we were looking to do with WWF was to understand how we can both grow the proportion of the sector represented by those sustainable activities, and also how do we transition the unsustainable blue economy activities to best practice sustainable practices. So with that in mind, I'll talk through a little bit of the history about how we've approached this problem and how we've arrived at the solution that we've arrived at today. So we've, as I mentioned, we've been working together with WWF since 2018. And that really started with looking at a small case study area in North Devon. And specifically, we were looking at identifying funding and finance models that could support North Devon's 7 marine protected areas. We produced a report that outlined what those potential opportunities could include. And one of those was an enterprise investment fund that could be used to invest in sustainable activities while creating returns that could be used to support marine conservation. So we chose the idea of this enterprise investment fund, what we call the Blue Impact Fund, for further investigation and exploration and testing. So the way that we went about that process of testing the fund and the opportunity was to do a really broad scoping study of the opportunity within the UK. We started looking at the North Devon area, and also we're looking at kind of outside North Devon across the whole of the UK to map what are the business models and opportunities to create new business models that can support the marine environment while generating returns for both investors and for donating back into the environment. So we met with around, I think, more than 80 different stakeholders who covered a range of activities across public sector activities, private sector activities, charities and other small organizations. And we identified over 50 opportunities for investing in sustainable marine activities. So we took those opportunities and we had a good look at what they needed, what kind of investment, what kind of funding and resource support they needed. And that really helped us to build and design the structure for this Blue Impact Fund concept. So the Blue Impact Fund was really based on what we found on the ground. I can talk a little bit in more detail, but we looked across a wide range of subsectors in the blue economy. So we looked at things like aquaculture and fisheries, we looked at ecotourism, we looked at maritime transport and a whole range of other subsectors. And what we found was that the seafood sector as a whole, the seafood supply chain, had some really readily investable models that were already being developed or were already fully operational, that really had the ability to create positive change and create positive impact for the environment. So then we further worked on the fund design and refined the business plan. And as I mentioned earlier, we informally launched the fund at the EKN Natural Capital Conference last year. So now our kind of current status is really that we are in fundraising mode. We're finalizing and building up our pipeline as well. And we're hoping to be able to start investing later in 2021. So I mentioned there very quickly about how we came to focus in on aquaculture and the seafood supply chain as a key opportunity for this first Blue Impact Fund. And I think there are two major reasons why we've decided to start with this as our focus. And those are, as I mentioned, that there are investment ready opportunities in this subsector, and also that there's not enough funding and finance that is tailored to the needs of that sector currently available in the market. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about the aquaculture supply chain or the seafood supply chain? We're looking across the whole spectrum. So we started looking at production predominantly, but then also expanded out to see how things like fish feed and hatcheries can be used to really create more sustainability within the sector and create greater environmental benefit. In terms of production, we're looking at, I guess, three main areas of production. So one is the offshore mariculture and nearshore aquaculture. We're looking at land-based recirculating aquaculture systems and their ability to create positive impact. And we're also looking at wild catch fisheries. And then further downstream in the supply chain, we're looking at processing, transport and storage, other technological innovation, certification and other consumer products that can be generated from these types of activities. Another important factor to do with why we're looking at aquaculture is that when it's done right, certain types of aquaculture have significant potential to create both environmental and social impact for the ocean and for the communities that depend on it. The key outcomes that we're targeting through our investments, we have quite a detailed list of the kind of outcomes that we're looking to achieve, but they can roughly be boiled down into these three main areas. So the first is around protecting and restoring marine ecosystems. The second is around reducing the climate and ecological footprint on the blue economy. And the third is around improving livelihoods, health and well-being for communities. So I've given you a bit of a background as to what we'll be investing in through the Blue Impact Fund, but how does this all work? How does this all fit together? And how is impact created through this funding model? So we've designed the fund as part of an aligned structure. So the fund, the Blue Impact Fund, will be doing investment into enterprises in the blue economy within the sustainable aquaculture subsector. And the fund will be aligned to a charitable trust that will also be supporting the marine environment through direct conservation efforts and additional grant funding programs. So how this works, at the core of the program, investors will be investing into the Blue Impact Fund directly, and that investment will then be made into these sustainable aquaculture enterprises that we identify as having the potential to create the returns that we're looking for, plus the environmental benefit. But once those returns are generated, the part of the return or the surplus return will be taken to and paid directly into the Ocean Recovery Trust, which is the charitable vehicle that I mentioned earlier. And so we're calling this our conservation dividend. And so what this is some grant funding to the Ocean Recovery Trust that will allow the Ocean Recovery Trust to fund direct marine conservation through ocean recovery programs, and also work to build up the sector and build up the sustainable revenue models and business models within the aquaculture and seafood supply chain. The other part of the Ocean Recovery Trust, or the reason why it's an aligned model and not necessarily included within the Blue Impact Fund itself is because we're hoping to be able to catalyse additional investment or additional funding from other donors and philanthropists. And then to bring this all together, the system works because the Blue Impact Fund and the Ocean Recovery Trust will really support each other. The Blue Impact Fund by creating the financial return that can then support these other grant funding programs, and the Ocean Recovery Trust building not only the future opportunities and future pipeline for Blue Impact Fund investment, but improving the market and the enabling elements that will help to really build a sustainable market for the blue economy subsectors. So where are we today? The Blue Impact Fund is currently fundraising for commitments from impact-driven investors. I mentioned that we are hoping to be able to formally launch our first investments later in 2021. We are also working to build upon our existing pipeline to ensure that we're ready to deploy capital into those projects. And we have some existing pipeline, but always interested to hear about more projects that are coming into the market. And then finally, we're in the process of developing the strategy and the structure for the Ocean Recovery Trust. So the idea is that the Blue Impact Fund will really catalyse and unlock this opportunity for delivering significant impact back into the marine environment. That's it from me, and I look forward to your questions.
That's great. Thank you, Olivia. I have one question. There's no questions in the chat at the moment, but I had one just generally around how the fund's been received by potential stakeholders looking to invest, or if there are other industries, marine industries, that are potential investors. How has this fund been received, and this design and structure and plan for investment been received by them?
Yeah, I think a key part of how we've developed the fund is really, it's been an iterative process, so constantly checking in with certain stakeholders and certain key parties and key delivery partners to make sure that what we're designing is relevant and appropriate and of interest to those people. We have engaged with investors, and I think the feedback's been really positive. And some of that investor feedback has featured into the kind of final and current version of the fund design. So again, we're trying to design something that works for everyone. In terms of other sectors and other stakeholders, I think there's been a lot of interest, particularly in the Ocean Recovery Trust, from I guess our charitable partners and stakeholders who are working in those predominantly grant funded and philanthropic funding areas. So we're still working on how we can best deliver our objectives through the Ocean Recovery Trust, and that's a process of kind of continuing engagement with our partners at WWF and also other partners as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, there's just a couple of quick questions here come in. So one from Alexander: do you have examples of the types of investors who contribute to the fund?
Yeah, so the types of investors that we're engaging with are predominantly impact-driven commercial investors, or highly impact-motivated high net worth and family offices who are looking to really create some impact alongside their financial returns.
Okay, the last one quickly from Christoph is, sorry, what size of investments will the fund be making?
Yeah, so at the moment, our current pipeline is looking at a fund size of about £1 to £10 million. So relatively small scale for other investment funds of this size, but this was the this was the area of the market that we identified had this investment need.
Okay, and Gail, did you want to come in?
Yeah, if I may. So Olivia, you talked about, I mean, the investors will seek a commercial return on their investments through the Blue Impact Fund, but you also talked about surplus return. So could you elaborate a little bit about, you know, what you mean by surplus return and how those extra funds, or how much you expect to be channeled through surplus return into the trust part of the structure?
Yeah, of course. So we have, and a lot of this is still subject to kind of final agreement with investors as well. But we have two main sources in mind for where that surplus return comes from, or that conservation dividend comes from. The core part of it is a contribution from Finance Earth. So we will be acting as fund manager of the fund, and we'll be contributing a portion of our fund management fee to the Ocean Recovery Trust. So that will be about 10%, I believe. Then the other portion of that conservation dividend will come from donations from investors. So the carried interest, or a portion of the carried interest above the target return, or the hurdle rate for investors, will be delivered into the Ocean Recovery Trust alongside that portion of fund management fees.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Olivia. Now, moving on to our final presentation, which is by Sarah Brown. Sarah is the manager of the brand new Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund, also known as SMEF. Her experience of engaging with coastal communities and relevant maritime and coastal issues as a freelance specialist in projects such as the Sullenvoe Master Plan and the Loch Creren and Loch Fyne Marine Biosecurity Plans, and previously as a marine planner in the Clyde, have come very much in handy with this role. As the current chair of Sea Changes, a UK volunteer-led grant-giving charity, there are significant useful parallels between SMEF and her experience as a strategic advisor to the Scottish Coastal Communities Fund. A cruising sailor, Sarah is actively involved with the boating scene in Scotland and developed the Scottish Marine Recreation and Tourism Survey for the Scottish Government. So quite a range of experience there, Sarah, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll just, hopefully I can share my screen there if everybody can see that okay. Yep. I had to get the Scottish Marine Recreation and Tourism Survey in there purely because I'm now working for SMEF, but I was doing SMRTS before. So I feel like I've actually progressed on. So it's actually pronounceable, the program I'm working for at the moment. Thank you very much for having me. This is great. The finance side of things is not my strength, but I am picking up an awful lot. And if anything you take away from this presentation I'm about to give, the one thing I would ask you to take away is I cannot do this on my own. We want to make sure that this fund is a great success. And I am pulling in all of the network, and I'm going to be leaning on the people that are on this call right now and throughout the Pioneers Network and beyond. So thank you very much for getting yourselves set up and ready for me. I really appreciate it, and great to have this opportunity to present to you. So the Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund is an exciting new initiative. It was founded in partnership between the public bodies of Marine Scotland, Crown Estate Scotland and Nature Scot, with the great support of key NGOs, including the Scottish Wildlife Trust, RSPB Scotland and the offshore wind energy industry. It's really important at the outset to establish that SMEF is not a Scottish Government fund. Contributions have been and will continue to be derived from external donors on a voluntary basis. At the moment, the post is hosted by Nature Scot, but as Gail pointed out earlier on, it's very important that the governance setup is absolutely robust, and so we're looking at that, and there's we'll see how that progresses as we go forward. The fund is very much in the early stages of development, but we are keen to raise awareness in order to stimulate discussion about projects and give potential donors a chance to come forward. So what actually is SMEF? Well, it is a new and exciting opportunity for all marine users. It's a unique fund made up of voluntary donations from those users of the marine environment, and it will support the delivery of marine and coastal environmental enhancement activities through grant-aided projects. So this is very much a grant fund, but at the one time I want to also say that we are interested in looking at these various different investment vehicles that Olivia and Gail have outlined. So whilst it is going to be a grant fund to start with, who knows? Let's see where we can go to from here. How did we get to where we are? Well, what has now been entitled the Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund, or SMEF to its friends, started life as an idea from the RSPB in discussion with Scottish ministers. That led to further discussions with the offshore wind industry sector in particular in 2019. And the Scottish Government, RSPB and Scottish Natural Heritage, or now Nature Scot, explored setting up the fund to support marine and coastal environmental enhancement projects. SMEF really came into being whenever the 1 billion challenge was launched in 2020, and it was identified as being one of the 9 pillars that supported that challenge. So there's not much of a challenge there, as in all I need to do is get £1 billion in and we'll be absolutely fine. SMEF generally does present an exciting opportunity, and I really am very proud to be part of it. It's an opportunity to reinvest in the health of our seas, enabling users benefiting from the rich marine natural resource to voluntarily reinvest in the natural capital so important to them. I think a lot of us have been around the block and maybe have heard similar words before, but actually what I'm hearing from industry is that they are genuinely keen to get involved with this. They can see it as a chance to support the sustainable growth of their sectors by safeguarding and enhancing that natural resource, whilst also demonstrating their commitment to healthier seas. It's also a way of building a stronger wellbeing economy for Scotland's coastal communities and their visitors by building community capacity to engage with habitat enhancement, resilience in the face of climate change. Why are we doing it now? Well, I think, as Gail pointed out earlier on, our seas are under a lot of pressure. It is an incredibly rich resource, this natural capital that we have. And the public profile of the pressure that this capital is under has never been higher. The use of our seas are now more complex, intense, and interactive than ever before. SMEF provides a timely opportunity to make a contribution to meeting Scotland's environmental targets and to supporting a green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. It was one of the reasons why we were particularly keen not to put it off despite the COVID-19 pandemic. SMEF will help to deliver on several key policy objectives. For example, the Blue Economy Action Plan, part of the Scottish Government's Programme for Government of 2020-21, but also the Scottish Government's Statement on Intent on Biodiversity post-2020, and, as I say, the Green Recovery. And of course, the 1 billion challenge. The core aims of SMEF are to establish a long-running, effective funding mechanism. Now, that in itself is quite a challenge. Long-running and effective, I think we can both spend a lot of time discussing both of those things as to what exactly do they mean. But what we want to do is to assist with the challenges of the climate and biodiversity crises through an emphasis on environmental enhancement projects. And I'll say a little bit more about what that means shortly. We want to assist with meeting Scotland's environmental aspirations and targets by giving opportunity for biodiversity gain, carbon reduction, and sequestration. We want to provide demonstrable corporate social responsibility opportunities by taking these voluntary contributions from relevant sectoral interests and encouraging other in-kind support, such as access to data and facilities. We also want to encourage research and development, which will genuinely support sustainable development of relevant industries. The kinds of projects that will be funded are still to be defined. However, it's likely the fund will cover a range of appropriate projects, such as those targeting nature-based solutions designed to alleviate the impacts of climate change, or restoration projects focused on important habitats, such as seagrass, salt marsh, dune systems, native oyster beds, and so on, particularly where improvements can actually be measured. We're also thinking about citizen science projects which engage communities in a new way about the seas around them, Or perhaps it might be more cetacean and seabird conservation actions, including those dealing with invasive species and biosecurity. And of course, I will imagine that marine litter will get a look in. What is less likely to be covered, or indeed definitely not to be covered, are other initiatives that are already well served by other funds. So I wanted to make it clear that these are not, the SMEF is not to replace the community funds that already exist in partnership with other wind farm developments, particularly on land. And it won't be supporting improvements to the built environment or wider onshore activities where there's no tangible link to marine ecosystems, habitats and species. We'll also be very strongly avoiding duplication of effort and of course not funding statutory functions, particularly of the sectors of interest. Who could be investing in the Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund? Well, pretty much anybody. I'll take a tenner from you if you fancy it at the end of the day. That's absolutely fine. But realistically, we're in this early stage of development and we've already benefited from the support and commitment from a range of key public bodies, NGOs and the offshore wind energy sector. And we are incredibly grateful to them for getting everything up and off the starting blocks. But through SMEF, what we want to do is to see new money. My key driver is that it's got to be new money, additional money for environmental enhancement being accessed. And we have begun the process to reach out to all the sectors making use of the marine environment. So that's oil and gas, renewable energy, fishing, recreation, aquaculture, all very familiar so far. But we're also talking to people like the water companies, the supply chain, everyone from floating hotels to people who make and sell marine electronics. So we're calling out to these people and we're asking them for their support and encouraging them to see this as an investment in their future. And that includes individuals as well. So those high net worth families that Olivia was referring to, I'll be asking you to pass this presentation on to them. SMEF will be targeting projects which deliver against a clear set of criteria defined in partnership with stakeholder input, including industry and academic experts. We're aiming to deliver projects which are innovative, potentially answering key questions about how we create more sustainable industries. We are brutally aware that we're all sitting in our spare bedrooms at the moment and that the economy is facing terrible challenges because of the pandemic. And some sectors may take more time to come on board because of this, but that doesn't mean that we can't get on with getting SMEF set up and running right now. And it's not only cash that we're seeking from people, it's also the value in kind that people can offer as well. And already we've had offers of support in terms of partnership, access to data, research facilities, and so on. So we'll be talking to businesses about that as well. There are some key challenges. I've already mentioned COVID, and of course you can't get through a presentation without mentioning Brexit these days. They are reducing the ability of businesses to invest. It does also take time for new opportunities like SMEF to gain credibility. So there are people saying, well, who are you and what are you doing and why should I invest with you? And it's also quite challenging to target effort to create immediate donations as well as long-term sustainable giving. Those are two almost quite separate asks whenever you're going to a donor. So that's something that we want to make sure that we get some money into the pot so that we can actually open the doors and start funding good projects. But we want to make sure that this is long-term and sustainable. I think one of the big challenges, particularly in the marine environment, is that some of these projects may take quite a long time to actually demonstrate the impact that they've had. And it's going to take quite a lot of brave investment from some donors to put the money into the pot to make that happen. So the next steps for SMEF, this is my to-do list really, is to develop a governance and operating framework, making sure that the process for application and donation are transparent and appropriate. And we're hoping to have the official launch planned for later in 2021. During this phase, we'll be approaching all of those with an interest in the marine environment who may wish to make voluntary contributions to the fund and encouraging those long-term commitments that I'm talking about. We do really welcome engagement with anyone interested in donating or knowing more about the fund. And I think it's been really interesting, those who have come forward already have helped me to shape my thinking about what is needed from this fund and where the opportunities might be for the donations to start flowing in. I genuinely think that by working with all marine sectors, SMEF will deliver outcomes much bigger than the sum of its parts. And I'm really looking forward to the formal launch later in 2021. So just a final say thank you for listening to me ramble on, and please do get in touch. Those are all my contact details. And if you've got any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thanks.
That was great. Thank you very much, Sarah. I've got a quick question here related to your presentation, and then we'll open up to any questions generally around marine funding. But this question comes in from John Utley, and it's, will there be regulatory or policy pressure on industry to donate to the fund? And I think this relates also to the fact that, we're looking, SME's looking for voluntary payments into the fund, and, how do you incentivize industries to pay into the fund? And yeah, I'll let you take it, Sarah.
I think the short answer to that is no. I think that unless we are, if we make the arguments well, and I think those arguments are coming through thick and fast with demonstration projects already showing biodiversity gain across the board, important work like Gail's been doing overseas, the work that Olivia's doing in terms of the big investments coming through. We're starting to see this shift happening where businesses can see how that investment in natural capital really benefits them. And the mood music that I'm picking up is that there's a ready appetite out there, and we just need to be knocking on the right doors. We're already funded to the point where we've got a project officer in post, and I'm hopeful that we can continue along in that vein. If we start getting to the point where we need to use legislative processes to insist on people donating, I think we've gone wrong somewhere much earlier along the line.
Okay, thanks. And a quick one from Christoph is, Sarah, are you able to share the names of any of the early funders to SMEF at the moment?
I'll already put on that first slide. We've got Crown Estate Scotland has stood up. We've got the Marine Scotland, Scottish Government, Nature Scot, and the offshore wind energy sector as well. It's an interesting question mark about, do you put logos, hundreds of logos up on a slide? Do you name and pat people on the back, whether they've given 50 quid or £500,000 quid? That's one of the questions that we need to look at within the governance framework of this, and to work out what actually is the greatest benefit to the fund, and to, what would be the benefit in naming people. Everybody knows who they are, the ones that have donated to this point, and I just put out a huge thank you to them.
Right, so I've got a question, I guess, for all three presenters really, and this regards contributions to funds and how you approach different stakeholders in terms of the amounts you're asking them to contribute. You could approach the offshore wind industry and ask for more money than you could, say, an inshore fisherman. And how do we address those the differences there, and approach stakeholders in a way that's, it doesn't put them off contributing, basically. I don't know who wants to have a go at that.
I mean, from SMEF's point of view, my approach to people is to talk to them about what it is that they get from their use of the marine environment. So I would never walk into somebody's office and say, well, you can't walk into somebody's office at the moment, but you get the idea. I would never go onto a Zoom call and start with, so why haven't you given us 50 grand? What I would start with is from the position of what do you think you get out of the marine environment? What is the service that you're using? What's the natural capital that is of benefit to you? And then work from there. It helps people to connect with why they use the marine environment and what it means to them, what that investment might return to them. And then you can start working towards how much that might look like. Don't know if anybody else has got comments on that.
Sure, I can come in here. I'd very much echo what Sarah said, and perhaps in a cruder way, it's about saying what's in it for them. So my example in the Caribbean, for instance, was to look at ways that we could encourage and incentivize the cruise ship industry to come on board and be an active and key contributor to the Caribbean's Blue Economy Financing Facility. So back in the 1990s, there'd been this whole back and forth between various Caribbean governments and the cruise ship industry around the imposition of the so-called head tax that the cruise ship industry didn't want because they said that that would push up their costs. You know, fast forward 20 years later, you know, the industry, well, the Caribbean captures about a 40, or captured prior to COVID, about a 40% market share in the Caribbean. You know, they use the marine assets. Therefore, it is reasonable to ask them to contribute to the ongoing conservation of those valuable marine assets. But rather than call it a head tax, we talked about a blue fee. We talked about how can we also give the cruise ship industry a seat at the table? How can we give them a voice in looking at how to drive forward marine conservation in the areas that they use alongside other stakeholders? How can we ensure through those robust governance arrangements that any blue fees are actually channeled into a fund or facility where the resources are transparently and accountably used for the purposes for which they're stated, and again where they have some kind of voice in some of that decision making as well. So language matters, and that can change the conversation entirely. And there's much more awareness nowadays than there was 20 years ago. And I think when people do see, you know, Sarah talked about the credibility, which will be hugely important as we drive forward this work in the Caribbean. You know, it is about establishing the reputation, I think, of those funds early on, that what they do is good, is effective, is transparent and accountable, and that will generate a virtuous cycle, I think.
I think just to add from a slightly different perspective, I guess. So our Blue Impact Fund is looking at more traditional forms of finance, I think, than perhaps the SMEF, which is looking to bring in donations and donative capital. And I think for us, our proposition to investors is similar to what Gail and Sarah have mentioned about, you know, making sure that you're proposing the whole package, you're able to show that you're going to create the kind of benefits that you're promising to create. But for us as well, I think a lot of that is driven from first looking at the pipeline and what our pipeline is and how what kind of size of investment and type of investment is most appropriate. We have a mantra at Finance Earth of the right capital for the right activity. And I think once you've identified what the right type of capital is, it makes it a lot easier to understand who the right type of investors could be. And so for us, we're looking at quite a specific group of very impact motivated types of investors who are also looking to generate a financial return. So knowing our pipeline and really understanding what the need is has helped us understand who our target audience is for investment as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So there's another question in from David Lindgren, and it looks like, Sarah, you've done a great job on your presentation because David's happy to give a tenner. But David's generally sharing some skepticism about whether voluntary contributions are a long-term funding model. So is there perhaps international precedent in an area that suggests he's unnecessarily pessimistic? Anyone?
Can I say thank you for the tenor and ask Gail or Olivia if they've got international examples?
Well, look, I mean, I'm happy to give a tenner too, Sarah, actually. It was a quick whip round. Look, I think, I mentioned this briefly in my earlier remarks, is that there has been a lot of thinking in conservation finance overall, including blue finance, around what kinds of marine funds can be established whereby you don't just rely on voluntary contributions, which can be unstable over time. They can be pro-cyclical and depend, in the current context, what we may well see over the next few years with reductions in companies, in governments, in philanthropic donors' abilities to contribute, which would have an impact on their programs. So how can you generate additional revenues, whether that's through tourism user fees, whether that's through credit reflows, because you essentially become a fund that is able to offer a much wider variety of financial instruments. So you can enter into lending and equity, and thereby hope to generate additional revenue streams for your activities over time, but in addition to receiving voluntary contributions. So biodiversity offsets are being considered quite a lot in environmental finance for the ongoing financing of environmental trust funds of various kinds. How far can those kinds of new innovative finance mechanisms also help to provide complementary financing streams as well?
And I would add to that to say that whilst we're looking at this, voluntary means different things to different people. There's voluntary and then there's voluntold. I think we've all been in those situations where we're being voluntold for various different things. So there is quite a lot of pressure to be encouraged to get involved in this. There's also the kind of the voluntary code of conduct type approach, where representative bodies may decide that it's something that their members should get involved with. So we're talking to people, representative bodies, various different sectors, to look at that kind of industry-wide standard where they might get involved in SMEF as the kind of default position. So it'd be an opt-out model rather than an opt-in model.
Okay, great. I've got a question around governance structures, and Gail raised this in her presentation, and obviously Sarah's in the early stages of developing that governance structure. And I was just wanted to put the question out there in terms of developing an effective governance structure. What are the key things that need to be considered? What do you have to get right to ensure that it works? I don't know, Gail, from your experiences with setting up other funds, maybe you have some insights there.
Sure. I mean, I don't think any one model, one approach fits all, but I think it's around, certain principles, so the fact that, you do provide channels for key stakeholders, whether they're, community associations or other NGOs, to actually participate and provide their views. There's a lot of best practice is very much down the line of multi-stakeholder governance structures as well, where you can bring in different expertise as well, from whether that's industry or academia, which might be specialized in the thematic areas. Again, local community representatives, government too matters, but again also ensuring that they are insulated from political interference as well has been is a topic that emerges quite a lot, especially in the context of some of the countries that I've been working in as well. And I don't know if you can ever 100% be insulated from that. That those political pressures will emerge, but that has to be recognized and some mitigating measures put in place. And then I think then structures for not just the overall governance, but that you also have sort of some of the specialist technical advisory support in addition to sort of the overall strategic direction of the entity. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Olivia or Sarah, do you have anything to contribute to that?
Yeah, I think just to add to what Gail's already mentioned in her introduction, as well as her answer to this question, that I think governance is one of the key points that we see as enabling any kind of financial flows into the kinds of projects that we're all trying to deliver into the marine environment. So we do some work at the moment as well in other marine environments, in developing contexts and other parts of the world. And I think that's, yeah, it's really the key, or one of a handful of key enablers to unlock investment and finance. And sometimes there are ready models that already exist, and sometimes you need to work with the appropriate people to kind of help build those governance structures and identify what's appropriate for the local area, for the type of investment and finance that you're trying to deliver, and the type of projects that you're trying to catalyze and mobilize and scale.
And just to add, very, very quickly, how the entity measures and reports on and communicates its impact to external stakeholders is also a key facet of effective governance arrangements as well. And there's a lot of focus now on impact measurement principles and standards in finance, beyond grant financing, so that will be an important consideration as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got a couple minutes left. So if you do have any questions, please get them in now. But there's one here from Donal Griffin, and I think it's an interesting question. I think, should money generated by specific sectors, for example, offshore wind or fisheries, be directed to projects specifically related to the environmental impacts of those same sectors? I guess it would be, Sarah, I wonder if you've got thoughts on this, because I think, I sit on the SMEF advisory board as well, and there's a lot of discussion around how to use any funds that do come in. So I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I was going to hand it back to you, Sam, because I'm just the person making this happen. You guys are the ones making the decisions in a lot of ways. So it is actually, I know it's a bit of a get out of jail free, but it's a little bit coming back to the steering group that's already behind SMEF, coming back to those people with the expertise to say, is that the most effective way of achieving what we want to achieve? And what we stated what we want to achieve is those things to mitigate climate change, reduce our impact on the environment, to restore and enhance those habitats. So if the evidence points us in the direction to say that, yes, if offshore wind or fisheries give a big chunk of money, then that money should go into offshore wind or fisheries projects. If the evidence supports that, then I think we should go that route. But if it doesn't, and it doesn't meet our aims of this broader environmental enhancement and supporting the whole marine ecosystem, then I think we need to think carefully about having too many silos. The marine environment, the marine mammals don't, they don't adhere to, oh, well, my damage came from this sector, or, this is this boundary or that local authority boundary or whatever. It's a transboundary issue, if you like. And I think that personally, I would say that probably not is the answer to that, unless there is a specific reason to go against that. Sam, would you, as somebody that's been involved with SMEF longer than I have, what do your thoughts be on that?
I would agree. I think the benefit of setting up SMEF is that we have this central pot of money that can be allocated to where it's needed, and it's not tied to a specific activity or sector. And I think that's what we really need at the moment, to level the playing field in a sense as to where money can be used. And by detaching it from a sector or a development, you can move it to anywhere in Scotland to invest there rather than where that immediate impact is. So I think it's key that any funds that are generated are not tied to, don't have limitations in that sense on how they can be used.
I think the question mark for me would be if a particular sector came in and said, here's a chunk of money, but I want it to go back into my sector, I would say, well, why are you coming through us? Why not just go and spend the money? You know, that's not what SMEF is set up for, in my mind.
Okay, well, there aren't any other questions there, so I think it's a good time to wrap up. So I'd like to thank Gail, Olivia and Sarah for your presentations, and to everyone for attending and your questions today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope it continues on the Conservation Finance Pioneer Group Basecamp site. I think there's still a lot of discussion to have, and as Ruchir mentioned, this is one of a series of webinars being set up by the Scottish Forum of Natural Capital. So please keep an eye out for any further webinars. But once again, thank you to our speakers today.
Thank you
Thank you
very much.
for having us.
Pleasure. Thanks very much indeed.
A lot.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.